December 16, 1985, East 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan, just before 6 in the evening. The Christmas lights are up, and the sidewalk is full of people going home from work. A black Lincoln pulls up outside Sparks Steakhouse, and Paul Castellano steps out. He is 70 years old, in a tailored overcoat, and he is the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States. He has no weapon. He has no security detail beyond the man driving him. He does not want any, because Paul Castellano believes something that has been true for 50 years, which is that a sitting boss cannot be killed without a vote. 4 men in identical trench coats and fur hats are already in position around him. In under a minute, in front of dozens of witnesses on a midtown street, the rule that held the American Mafia together for half a century stops existing. What the public got afterward was a character, the Dapper Don. Silk suits and a grin on the courthouse steps, beating case after case, a gangster who looked like a movie star and acted like a celebrity. For 6 years, he was the most photographed criminal in America. The photographs were the point, and that is what almost nobody understood at the time. John Gotti did not become famous because he enjoyed attention, although he did. He became famous because after that night on 46th Street he needed to be. A hidden boss can be killed quietly and explained away. A boss on the front page of every newspaper in New York cannot. The celebrity was not vanity, it was armor, and he put it on because he knew exactly what he had done. You have to understand what the commission actually was. Since the 1930s, it functioned as the Supreme Court of the 5 families. No boss dies without the other bosses agreeing. The rule existed for one reason, and it was not honor. It was self-preservation. Without it, every ambitious captain in New York would be one shooting away from a promotion, and the entire business would collapse into a war that nobody could afford. Gotti did not just kill a man that night, he proved the rule was optional. So here is what you are going to hear. Why Castellano was already a dead man to his own family before Gotti ever moved. What the other 4 families decided in the months afterward. Which of Gotti's closest allies got into his car 4 months later and never got out. And why the murder that made him boss is the same murder that guaranteed he would not stay one. And what the commission did about it, which is the part of this story that almost never gets told properly. Because the vote they never held in 1985 still had to happen eventually. To understand why Gotti did something so reckless, you have to understand what Paul Castellano represented. Castellano was not a street boss, he was a corporate boss. After the death of Carlo Gambino in 1976, Castellano inherited the family, not because he was the most feared man in the organization, but because he was the most connected to the legitimate world. He understood construction, unions, concrete, and the quiet corruption of industries that generated millions without a single headline. He ran the family from his Staten Island mansion, a white-columned estate known as the White House, complete with a swimming pool, manicured lawns, and a level of insulation that made him seem more like a CEO than a criminal kingpin. He rarely visited the social clubs where soldiers gathered. He preferred meetings in his kitchen, surrounded by family, away from the noise of the street. To men like John Gotti, this was not sophistication. It was weakness, dressed up as class. Gotti was the opposite. He grew up in poverty in the South Bronx, one of 13 children, scraping for money and respect in neighborhoods where a man's reputation was the only currency that mattered. By the 1970s, he was a hijacker, a loan shark, a gambler, and a made man in the Gambino family, operating out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. He liked nice suits, fast cars, and the kind of loyalty that came from men who feared him as much as they admired him. He was not building a corporate empire, he was building a personal army, and he looked at Paul Castellano the way a field commander looks at a general who has not seen combat in decades. The tension between the 2 men had been building for years. Castellano disapproved of Gotti's flashiness. He thought the younger man attracted attention, broke discipline, and treated the family business like a personal brand. He was right. Gotti saw himself as the future, and he saw Castellano as an obstacle. But the real trigger was not ego. It was survival. In 1985, both men knew the FBI was closing in. Castellano was already under federal indictment in a massive racketeering case that would later be known as the Commission case. Gotti was facing charges related to hijacking and drug trafficking, but the real danger came from inside the organization. Castellano had begun to suspect that Gotti and his crew were involved in heroin dealing, a violation of the family's rules that Castellano had publicly and violently enforced against other members. If Castellano moved against Gotti's crew, Gotti knew he would be next, so he made a calculation. Kill the boss before the boss kills him, and do it without asking permission from anyone. The conspiracy that followed was not impulsive, it was meticulous. Gotti did not act alone. He brought in his closest allies. Sammy Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull, a man whose loyalty to Gotti would later become one of the most famous betrayals in American crime history. Frankie DeCicco, a respected capo who helped plan the logistics. And the shooters themselves, men selected for their calmness under pressure, their anonymity to the public, and their willingness to follow orders without asking questions. The location was chosen carefully. Sparks Steakhouse was not a mob club. It was a legitimate, high-end restaurant where Castellano felt safe. The timing was chosen to coincide with the Christmas season, when the streets were crowded, the police were distracted, and the city's rhythm made a quick escape easier. The shooters wore matching coats and hats, not as a uniform, but as a disguise. Witnesses would remember the outfits, not the faces. By the time anyone could organize a coherent description, the killers were gone. The murder itself took less than a minute. 6 shots. Castellano never had a chance to react. Bilotti, who was supposed to be the boss's protection, was dead before he could reach the weapon he was carrying. The shooters did not speak. They did not hesitate. They did not leave a message. The message was the act itself. Anyone who looked at that sidewalk outside Sparks understood the meaning immediately. The rules had changed. The old system was dead. But the commission was still alive, and the other bosses were not going to accept the murder of a sitting boss without consequences. Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family, known as the Chin, was particularly dangerous in his response. Gigante was a man who had built his entire career on invisibility. He walked the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, muttering to himself, pretending to be mentally ill to avoid prosecution. But behind the act was one of the most calculating minds in organized crime. He understood that if Gotti's move went unanswered, every family would face its own internal rebellion. The Chin did not call a meeting to debate the issue. He began planning a response that would remind everyone what happened to men who killed bosses without permission. The retaliation came on April 13, 1986. Frankie DeCicco, the man who had helped Gotti plan the Castellano hit, was walking toward his car in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. The vehicle was parked outside a social club, a familiar and supposedly safe location. DeCicco got into the passenger seat. As he sat down, a bomb detonated underneath the car. The explosion was not meant for Gotti, who was supposed to be at the same meeting but had cancelled at the last minute. It was meant for DeCicco, the man the Genovese family had identified as the architect of the Castellano conspiracy. The bomb was a message written in fire and metal. You can kill a boss, but we will kill the men who helped you, and we will not stop until the debt is paid. That detail will matter in 15 minutes. Because the bombing of Frankie DeCicco did not end the war, it escalated it, and it revealed something that Gotti had not fully calculated when he ordered the Castellano hit. He had made himself the boss, but he had also made himself the target of every family that believed the old rules still mattered. Gotti's response was not to retreat, it was to double down. He understood that his survival now depended on visibility. A hidden boss could be killed quietly. A famous boss was harder to touch, so he did something no mafia boss had ever done deliberately. He became a public figure. He walked through Little Italy in broad daylight, surrounded by cameras. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, where FBI surveillance teams photographed him constantly. He gave the media a character they could sell, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the man who beat the system. Every acquittal made him more famous. Every headline made him harder to kill without creating a national scandal. The publicity was not vanity, it was armor. But the armor had a flaw, and that flaw was named Sammy Gravano. Gravano had been with Gotti since the beginning. He had participated in the Castellano planning. He had committed murders on Gotti's orders. He had risen to the position of underboss, the second most powerful man in the family. But by the early 1990s, the relationship had soured. Gotti's ego had grown beyond the man Gravano thought he had allied with. On FBI wiretaps, recorded inside the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti could be heard bad-mouthing Gravano. blaming him for failures, calling him greedy, questioning his loyalty. Gravano did not know about the tapes at first, but when federal prosecutors finally arrested both men in 1990, they showed Gravano the evidence. They let him hear his boss, the man he had killed for, the man he had helped seize an entire crime family, describing him as a liability. The betrayal that followed was not emotional, it was operational. Gravano understood the mathematics of the situation. Gotti was facing life in prison. The federal case was built on the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allowed prosecutors to charge the entire leadership of a criminal enterprise as a single conspiracy. If Gravano stayed silent, he would go to prison alongside Gotti, and he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, while the man who had insulted him on tape continued to believe he had won. If Gravano cooperated, he could reduce his sentence, protect his family, and dismantle the entire machine he had helped build. He chose to cooperate. In 1991, Sammy Gravano became the highest-ranking mafia defector in American history, and his testimony destroyed John Gotti. The trial was not a close contest. Gravano described the Castellano hit in detail. He described the planning, the selection of shooters, the meeting afterward where Gotti celebrated the murder. He described dozens of other crimes, murders, extortion schemes, loan sharking operations, union corruption, gambling networks. The jury heard not just the accusations of prosecutors, but the voice of the man who had stood next to Gotti while the decisions were made. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all charges. The Teflon Don had finally met a surface the mud would stick to. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure federal prisons in the country. The man who had killed a boss to become the boss was now locked in a cell 23 hours a day, his contact with the outside world reduced to monitored phone calls and censored mail. The public version of John Gotti ended with a dramatic courtroom scene. The real version ended with a slow, quiet disappearance into the federal prison system. Gotti died on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. He died of throat cancer at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was not surrounded by family. He was not giving final orders to loyal soldiers. He was a prisoner wearing a standard-issue uniform, dying in a facility designed to hold men the government had decided were too dangerous to ever release. The man who had built his legend on defiance, on style, on the image of untouchable power, died in a place where no cameras were allowed. The other families had never forgiven him. After Gotti's conviction, the Gambino family was placed under the leadership of a rotating panel of senior capos, quietly approved by the commission. The Genovese family, still led by Vincent Gigante until his own conviction in 1997, made sure that no Gambino boss would ever again rise to the level of public visibility Gotti had achieved. The family continued to operate. The money kept moving. The unions kept paying. The construction contracts kept getting manipulated. But the spotlight was gone. The Gambino family went back to what it had been before Gotti, a criminal enterprise that preferred silence to fame and survival to ego. Hollywood never made a proper film about the Castellano hit. The story appeared in television movies, in documentary series, in books written by journalists and former prosecutors, but the full weight of what Gotti did has never been captured in a 2-hour script. The public version of the Dapper Don was a story about charm, defiance, and the failure of the justice system. The real story was darker. It was a story about a man who broke the most important rule in the organization he claimed to represent, who seized power through murder without consent, who protected himself with celebrity, and who was finally destroyed not by the government, but by the man who had helped him build the machine in the first place. The lesson of John Gotti's rise and fall is not about the inevitability of justice. It is about the fragility of power built on fear alone. The commission existed to prevent exactly what Gotti did. By killing Castellano without a vote, Gotti proved that the commission was not a permanent institution. It was an agreement. And agreements only hold as long as the men involved believe they are safer honoring the deal than breaking it. Gotti broke the deal. And for a few years, he looked like a genius. He looked like the one man who had outsmarted the entire system. But the system did not forget. The Genovese bomb under Frankie DeCicco's car was the first answer. Sammy Gravano's testimony was the final one. The commission did not need to kill John Gotti. It needed to wait until his own choices produced a witness. And when that witness spoke, the man who had killed a boss without permission became a lesson for every future capo who might consider the same move. The streets of Midtown Manhattan have changed since 1985. Sparks Steakhouse is still there, still serving expensive cuts of meat to a clientele that probably does not think about the sidewalk outside. The Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy is now a boutique clothing store. The Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park is gone, replaced by the ordinary commerce of a neighborhood that no longer belongs to the mob. But the story remains, not as a legend, not as a folk tale, as a warning. Power taken without consent is power that must be defended forever, and no man, not even the Teflon Don, can defend forever. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment below. Was John Gotti a visionary who saw the mafia needed to change, or just an egomaniac who destroyed the institution to save himself? We read every take.